As I share this gospel account with you, three people come to my mind as paralyzed. The first is a young woman whom I knew in my neighborhood where I grew up in downtown Jersey City. Her name is Jeanette. She's a very beautiful woman. And in my summer walks, as I would pass her, as she sat on her stoop, mind you, in the city, you sit on a stoop, not on a porch. As she sat there, many a night I would pass by and she would give me this beautiful smile and wave at me. All of a sudden, Jeanette was no longer seen there. And one day, the parish priest made it known to me that she had become blind and she was now paralyzed, laying in bed, bedridden. He invited me to go and see her, but I refused because I had this crazy notion that as a blind person, she would want to touch my face. And for whatever reason, this was something that was not easy for me to do. And each time that he invited me, each time I said no. And finally, one day, I broke down the barrier and I was able to go and see Jeanette, only to find her laying there in bed with a beautiful smile on her face, and she made it known that she remembered me as that little boy who often passed her on the summer evenings. As time would go on, Jeanette and I developed a beautiful relationship. She's now gone home to God, and I pray that she helps me through this talk this evening. The second paralyzed is a man who I met by accident. By that I mean I was a parish priest before I became a bishop, and before I was sent to the major seminary at Seton Hall to be a spiritual director for 1 year. And as I was a parish priest at St. Raphael in Livingston, one Sunday I was sharing with the people what had happened the prior week when we had for the first time in the history of that church the anointing of the sick at a Sunday liturgy. And I used that as a way of letting people know that this was a sacrament for many people who failed to make themselves available to it. After that Mass, this woman came up to me and asked if I would go and visit her husband who was in the hospital, and I said I certainly would, and the next day I did, and I went to the Kessler Institute, not knowing anything about the man and assuming that he was my parishioner because this woman was also assumed to me to be my parishioner, only to find out that the man came from Revere in Massachusetts because of the reputation of Kessler Institute. Paralyzed from the neck down, could only move his head. And when I found this out, I was quite amazed, and I said to him, I thought you were my parishioner. And he thought that I was not going to give him Holy Communion. When I said, no, I said, I just thought you were a section of my parish that was called Revere, and I knew nothing about it. AJ and I have become friends for a number of years, but again, God decided to call him home, and I went to visit him before that happened as a bishop, and I shared liturgy with him within his home. That after the Mass, I asked him if I could have a picture taken with him. So I took my mitre off, which I wore just to make him feel happy, and I took off my pectoral cross, put it around his neck and the mitre on his head, and he just beamed with great joy. Only to find that just 2 years ago, I was called by his wife that he had just died, and I went up to Massachusetts to celebrate the funeral liturgy. The third person who's paralyzed is a detective, Detective McDonald. Some of you may have heard of him, but you're probably too young. He was a detective working the rounds in Central Park in New York City. And one day he came upon these young children who he thought there was something suspicious about them. Only to find that as he approached them, one of them took out a gun, who was only about 14 years of age, and shot him. And as a result, he too became paralyzed from the neck down, while his wife was in the hospital waiting to give birth to their one and only son. Officer McDonald and I have developed something of a relationship mainly because we went together to Lourdes about 3 years ago to be with special needs people, and I just recently came upon him at St. Pat's Cathedral in New York City, and he just beamed when he saw me as we were able to share a few moments of time and reflecting on our experiences that took place at Lourdes. paralyzed man is important in this talk, but not because of his paralysis, but more importantly, because of the number 4, if you listened attentively. It's 4 men who carry the paralyzed man to Jesus. And so I like to use that as a way of saying something about my call to the priesthood. It's a beautiful passage. And sometimes we might ask ourselves the question, was it the 4 men who wanted to bring the paralyzed man to Jesus because they knew of Jesus' reputation? Or was it the paralyzed man himself who wanted to go to Jesus, and he sought out 4 men to carry the litter so that he might be able to approach Jesus? And then, as you know, the crowd is so big that they had to open up the roof. He's lowered from the roof, and then Jesus enters into the dialogue with him. As we speak of those 4 people, I like to believe that they represent many others. And so for tonight, I share with you what I believe that this gospel account has come to have greater and greater meaning for me through my years. As we start to think about the call to the priesthood, I want to begin with the fact that the call to the priesthood is really a mystery. Why is God asking you right now to discern your priesthood? Or why did God call Father Jim and I, to the priesthood? And when we stop to think of it, we might find that there are 4 different ways that God makes himself known to us and what his will for each one of us. I'd like to share with you a simple story about how I came to know something about my calling to the priesthood, and it's somewhat unusual. I was a 2nd grader, only 7 years of age. And one day, Sister, who was the religious nun who taught us in those days, we were 60 students in a classroom, 2 of us to a bench. And so this day she had what was known as oral composition. Each one of us had to go before the class and to share with the class what we wanted to be once we grew up. Well, I stood before the class, and as I looked at my classmates, I said, I want to become a priest. And I thought that was enough, and so I walked back to my desk when Sister stopped me in my tracks, and she put both hands on her hips. I still see it till today. And she said, Thomas, now you must tell me why it is that you want to become a priest. And so midway down the aisle, I said, because my brother Nino is going to be a priest. She was happy with that. I was happy with it. But there's something to all of that, and that's why I share it with you. Because in those days, my brother was a senior in high school, and all of his friends, 4 of them, had already made application to Seton Hall University, to what was then known as the Divinity School. The college seminary was known as the Divinity School as part of the university. And 4 of them had made applications, so I assumed that my brother also was going with them because he was very close to them. Those men, 3 of those 4 men, have persevered in finding that God had called them. One actually became a bishop, and I grew into a greater relationship with him, Bishop Saltarelli, that Jim may know, and God has called him home also. But he's had a very strong impact on my life. So as I think about that, I begin to recognize that there was something happening from my 7th year of life, that God was beginning to call me. That's somewhat unusual, and I'm not saying that it was in any mysterious way, any extraordinary way, but in a mysterious way, because God calls us in certain ways, and so it happened through a simple example of what takes place in the classroom. Sister Jeanette is the woman who is still alive and still very active in her ministry, so much so that she gave me this pectoral cross that I wear tonight, and I wear it with great honor because she's a Filipini sister, and her foundress is St. Lucy Filipini, whose image is on the cross. And each time that I wear it, I think of the many sisters, in addition to Sister Jeanette, who had a lot to do in the way that I persevered in my vocation. Looking back on the small but significant early years of my life, I believe that the mystery of my calling came from God speaking to me through a religious sister who encouraged me to articulate it and for a brother who was a model for me in my formative years, and then for the environment of my parish community that made me consider the call. Excuse me. I come from a family of 6 children. I have 2 sisters and 3 brothers. I'm the 5th of the 6th of them. My parents were very simple. They immigrated from Italy and found themselves in Lower Jersey City. And it was in that environment that I feel that God had something to say to me. To this day, both of my parents instilled within me, in me, and in all of us, what might be called today the gospel values. God was present in our lives, and in a sense, a devotional prayer, that was so much a part of our growing up years. I can remember praying the rosary with my youngest brother and my mom many a night as she began to prepare the meal for the next day. It was within that kind of an experience of prayer that I began to realize that God was calling me to something a little out of the ordinary. As I continued to look to my family, I began to recognize the fact that we all had to struggle in one form or another. But the one thing that my dad wanted for each of his sons, unfortunately just for his sons, because it was part of the Italian tradition, that the sons would be educated and not so much the daughters, at least at that point in time. And so Dad saw to it that each of us received a Catholic education. 3 of us graduated from college, and my brother John, who was the only one who graduated from high school, from Catholic high school, but then immediately went on to work. Our Catholic formation has helped us to experience the different expressions of our prayer, which enabled me to hear my calling from within my family and my friends. Wanting always to do God's will, I was moved to take the necessary steps. So one night I decided, after my parish priest had invited me to make application to our divinity school, I announced at the dinner table, that the next day I was going with Father Lou to make my application. My father looked at me and he says, "Does that mean that you're not getting married and you're not going to have children?" To which I responded, "Yes, Pa." And that was the end of it. Eventually my father did come around and he began to take great pride in me as a seminarian, certainly as a priest, but he didn't live long enough to see me as a bishop. However, there's something important in my life that I always cherish, and this was his wedding band that I eventually made into my Episcopal ring. As I tried to stay close to my dad through my everyday experiences as a bishop, as the chain that holds this particular pectoral cross belonged to my mother. So in many ways I find through an external that I can continue to be affiliated with them. Another man in that represents the religious sisters and priests of my parish who knew of my intentions but encouraged me in many ways, but always respecting my privacy so that I can go on living a life as an ordinary young boy would do so, even through my years of high school. They were happy years. I was at a coeducational school, and it was there that I really believed that God helped me to understand what my calling was all about. It was a small school run by the Sisters of Charity. It was a parish school, and we had many good days there, and often I find myself still in touch with my high school classmates. The third man represents for me the community, in particular the parish community, for the church was the center of our lives. It was there that we would often congregate at night with other priests and other men and young boys. And as it was, the parish was also the place where the CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization, had its setting so that we would have all kinds of activities taking place in our lives. It was often after evening prayer, not the evening prayer of the church, but a devotional prayer that many of us would gather around the priest, and it was he who would share his life and his love for God and the church that continued to help me to recognize how God was calling me. The fourth person represents the quest for prayer in each of our struggled in many ways through my early years, but it was the experience of prayer and the sacraments that helped me to hear and understand God's call. As a high school student, I continued to serve Mass. One day, in the heat of summer, as a classmate and I were ready to go out to serve the priests at a Sunday liturgy in which there was a great honor being placed upon Mary, our mother, as it was the custom of the times to give honor to the patroness of a region in Italy, and most of them found that the patroness would be Mary under a different title. We had the visiting priest called Father Dante di Girolamo. Dante is still alive, and as he came to me within the sacristy before the Mass began, he said to me, "Do you want to become a priest?" To which I responded, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Well, how do you want to become a saint?" I'm sorry, "Do you want to become a saint?" To which I responded, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Well, how do you want to become a saint?" And I said, "I hope someday that I would be a priest, and that would lead me to sanctity." And he said, "Very good." He celebrated his 50th anniversary a few years ago, and so when I went to see him, I decided that it was time for us to go out to dinner. And at dinner, I shared with him this simple story, and he took great joy in it. I said, "Dante, you don't know how much you've influenced my life, not only as a young boy, but through the years as a priest," because he's very old, not very old, he's older now, retired, and not able to function as he'd like to, because his health does not allow him to do that. So God continues to call us through different people and in different ways. And as we understand that, then perhaps we can see that the mystery of our calling continues to unfold for us as we see ourselves united in the experiences of prayer. In the 70s, there was a big movement to recognize the human side of Jesus. And yet when I stopped to think about that, I could never understand it, because Jesus was very human for me in my growing up years. It was the only way that I could relate with him. I did not see him as the all-powerful God, but more importantly, the man who wanted to walk the walk of life with me. And so when the big fuss was made, I felt that I was ahead of the curve, and so I was grateful to God that I had seen his son Jesus in a very human fashion, who continued to live the kind of life that I was living, having the struggles that I was having. As we look back on all of these four representatives, then I begin to wonder now, how did I bring people to Jesus? I can give you many examples. I'm a priest for almost 47 years. But what I often heard from others is that they would tell me it was a small but significant way that through my sensitivity and my compassion, I had touched them. And as a result of that, I brought them closer to Christ. In many instances, and probably almost all of them, I wasn't conscious of it, just doing my priestly work. But that's what tells me the ways that I brought people to Jesus, as these men bring the paralyzed man to Jesus. But as we stop and think about that, then I have to recognize, well then, what is it that I'm doing to bring other people to Jesus? They bring me to Jesus now. And as I shared some of the experiences, all three of the paralyzed people in my story tonight helped me to understand who Jesus was and how he was calling me to the priesthood. All through my years, I've done all that I could to help men to discern a call to the priesthood. In my first assignment, two young men who were my altar servers both entered a seminary. One is a happy priest down in Florida. The other was a happy priest until a few years after his ordination, when he began to recognize he could not live a celibate life. So he left active ministry and sadly married. I say sadly married because he was divorced, but since then has remarried and now is living a happy and a holy life. In my second assignment, I found myself encouraging the nighttime receptionist, who was a young man, who then went away. He was in college and went away to Australia for one of his semesters, and when he came back, I encouraged him to think about the priesthood, and it was that added push that he needed that he finally took the step, and today he's a great pastor, great priest in a parish in Hocus. You know of whom I speak?
Yes, I do.
It's not important. Anyhow, this very incident was written up in one of the Vocation newsletters as Father Jim shared his life with others. I found myself sharing the priesthood with a number of men that right now I'm working with 4 of them who are discerning the priesthood, not as you are in this kind of a setting, but through their own everyday lives. One feels very much committed, the other is questioning it, and the other 2, I think God has a calling for them, at least within the ministry in the church, but maybe not as a priest. As we listen to all of these words tonight, I would hope that you would stop in a few moments in our moments of silence to stop and think about who might be the 4 people that helped you to come to this point in your life, and to see what they're doing about bringing you closer to Jesus, to know what God's will is for each of you. And then I would also invite you, as I invited others to stop and think and discern the priestly life, that you in this journey, at this point in your life, might be able to do the same. That you can stop and think about some of the men and women that you might know, whom God is calling to work in a special way within the ministry of the church, and in doing so, that you might find that they journey with you and that you're helping them in this discernment process. So it's been a joy for me tonight to share a few things, simple thoughts with you about my life as a priest and how I came to understand my calling to the priesthood. I pray for you each day. I pray for vocations. It's a very important part of my life. It's at least one morning prayer that I pray each day. But I also pray for priests, that they too might be the model and the example that will help others to recognize their calling from God. So as I pray for you, I'm inviting you to pray for me, so that I might be the compassionate and holy priest